Everything has a price. Have you ever wondered what determines the price? In the system that we live in, which is capitalism, it's a market that determines the price. Every market has two sides, the supply and the demand. No economic students can step out of an economics course without knowing supply and demand. So let's start with the demand side. Quantity demanded is the amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. According to the law of demand, the quantity demanded of a good is negatively related to the price, holding other things equal. What does that mean? Negatively related. The quantity of a good is negatively related to the price. What does it mean in plain words? Well, as the price goes up, the quantity demanded of a good comes down. As the price comes down, the quantity demanded of a good goes up. So they move in opposite direction. Because of this negative relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, typically we have a downward sloping or negatively sloped demand curve. So this is how we draw a typical demand curve. The price of the good or the service is always on the vertical axis. In your math class, you probably are used to using x and y axis, but very often in economics courses, we use x and y to denote other things. So I would prefer to use the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. So for a demand curve, you have the price on the vertical axis and the quantity for the goods, quantity of the goods or the service on the horizontal axis. A lot of times, we're not only interested in individuals' demand, we are also interested in the market demand, especially for businesses. Okay, so businesses are very much interested in the market demand instead of the individual's demand. So here's how an individual demand is associated with the market demand. So on the very left-hand side, this is the individual demand curve of individual buyer A. Let's assume that there are only two individual buyers in this market. So the second one, the second demand curve, this one, is the individual demand curve of buyer B. Okay? So let's pick any price arbitrarily. So P1, for example. So we find out that at P1, individual A is willing and able to buy 10 units. At the same price, individual B is willing and able to buy 15 units. So when you are asked about the market demand, we can say that at P1, the quantity demanded for the market is 25 units. So we do it for every single price level, and we'll be able to derive the market demand from individual's demand. So as you can see, the market demand is simply the horizontal sum of each individual's demand curve. Next, we're going to take a step back to talk about some of the particular language that we use in economics courses. Just like many other disciplines, economics has its own language. So it is important that we are speaking the same language so that we are on the same page all the time. So here we are getting quite fussy with some of the wording. Okay? A change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. In magazines or in newspapers, you hardly see these words. Okay? So in fact, a lot of times you don't even see the word demand. You just see people writing, people buy more, people buy less, and so on and so forth. Okay? But in this classroom setting, it is very important that we are very particular about the language or the wording that we use so that we don't get confused in the near future. So a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. So a change in demand, technically a change in demand is illustrated by a shift in the demand curve. Okay? A shift of the demand curve, actually. A shift of the demand curve. And then a change in quantity demanded is illustrated by a movement along the demand curve. So to make it easier, let's look at the diagram. So on the right-hand side, so what we see here is what we call a change in quantity demanded. So we start out with price 1, so this is the initial price, okay? And for some reason the price drops to P2, okay? So you can see that at P1 initially the quantity demanded is Q1, okay? As the price drops to P2, the quantity demanded increases to Q2, okay? So we have a rightward movement along the demand curve, and this is what we call a change in quantity demanded. We do not call this a change in demand. So, and it is caused by one thing, it's caused by the price, by a change in the price. Okay? So on the other hand, let's look at the left-hand side. So what we see here is initially we have this demand curve, so let's denote it as D1, okay, D1, okay, and then we have an increase in demand, so it is illustrated by a shift of the demand curve, okay? So we call this a change in demand, okay? So as the price, so when you look at this, even if the price is held constant, I'm not saying that the price is held constant, but even if the price is held constant, you can see that with a shift like this, the quantity demanded increases from Q1 to Q2, even though the price doesn't change. So that means there are other factors other than the price level itself that has caused this increase in demand. So, and it applies to every single price level. So we call this a change in demand. Are we okay with the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded? So before we go into the reason why we have a shift, so what caused the shift of the demand curve, so let's just play with the demand curve a little bit so that we are familiar with the graphical representations. So this is an increase in demand. I'm sorry. So this is an increase in demand, and it is illustrated by a rightward shift of the demand curve. Okay? So we want to be very clear with the labeling. So the initial demand curve is denoted as D sub 1, okay? and the new demand curve is illustrated as D sub 2. Usually, to avoid confusion, I throw in an arrow to show the direction. Okay? So you can use D0, D1, D star, D double star, D prime, D double prime, as long as it is very straightforward to the reader that which comes first. So on the other hand, we have a decrease in demand. We have a decrease in demand, which is illustrated by a leftward shift of the demand curve. Okay? So as you can see,